Hi, this is Bob Nielsen again, Extension Corn Specialist at Purdue University in Indiana. This is part 2 of a 3-part presentation on high-yield corn and focusing on the fundamentals. When I ended the first segment, I left you with these 3 options for increasing corn yields. The first 2 are rather tongue-in-cheek, but they do apply to many of the folks who enter national corn yield contests, in my humble opinion. So one option to increasing corn yields is to simply shoot blindly at the target and hope that it works. A related second option is to simply throw the entire kitchen sink at the yield challenge and hope that it works. Now, I said that I do believe these first 2 options are ones that are often used by folks who enter national corn yield contests because, frankly, their only goal is to win the contest. To a certain degree, they don't care how they get the high yields. They simply want high yields. And so if that's your goal, is to win a corn yield contest, well, go ahead and shoot blindly. Go ahead and throw the kitchen sink, and you might get the high yields. The challenge for the rest of us is that using those 2 options, and let's say you're successful and you get the high yields, you don't necessarily know how you got the high yields because you threw everything at it and you don't know which one or which combination of things were the ones that gave you the high yields. So for the rest of us, I think the third option is the one to use, and that is to approach this challenge of increasing corn yields from a more thoughtful agronomic perspective. And that thoughtful perspective includes things like taking time to improve your agronomic knowledge, never stop learning, always go to a meeting and come home with one thing that you can put to use for the next growing season. This thoughtful perspective also includes taking the time to identify and locate and diagnose the causes of those yield-limiting factors that are important for your operation. And then finally, once you have this information, then you can make some sound agronomic decisions based on facts and data and not simply on what you read and hear. And at the end of the day, our goal is to optimize the 4 components of grain yield. And these are number of plants per acre, number of ears per plant, number of kernels per ear, and the weight of those individual kernels. Now, it's important to recognize that I say we should optimize these 4 components. I didn't say maximize, because it's physiologically pretty hard to literally maximize each of these components of grain yield because they're linked physiologically. And so, for example, if you continue to increase plants per acre, at some point in time, those plants are going to respond to that stress, and they'll reduce the number of kernels or they'll reduce the kernel weight. So rather than aiming to maximize these 4 yield components, we need to think more about what can we do to optimize them. What's the best combination of these yield components that are going to help us increase corn yields in the future? Now, these yield components don't just develop overnight. They don't develop at one time during the season. These individual components develop throughout the entire growing season. So, achieving high yields requires us to try to minimize stress throughout the entire season also. Now, what I can tell you is that high-yielding corn requires a uniform and healthy crop canopy that's capable of intercepting and utilizing almost all of the incoming sunlight by the time the crop gets to pollination and throughout the entire grain field period. And understanding that one simple fact gives us something to aim for as we look for ways to increase yields. We need to do everything we can to assure that we develop a uniform crop canopy and keep it healthy from pollination through the end of grain filling. Now, final plant population, somewhat interestingly, is largely determined early in the season. And it's determined by the success of germination, emergence, and the remainder of the stand establishment period. And understand that stand establishment does not end at emergence. It ends at about the 6th leaf collar stage, roughly 30 to 45 days after planting, when the crop is maybe knee-high. At that point in time, we can say stand establishment is complete. And what you hope at that point in time, you hope that you have a uniform, healthy, vigorous crop growing in the field, and not something like you see in this picture in the background. In addition to determining final plant population that early in the season, the health and uniformity of those plants by the 6th leaf collar stage has a huge impact on the potential growth rates throughout the remainder of the season and the ability of those plants to tolerate stress. So it's sort of this longer term effect of the uniformity and the health of the crop that causes some impact later on in the season, while at the same time it has that immediate impact of determining or largely determining final plant population. These are the kinds of factors that impact the success of stand establishment. And what I've done on this slide is I've highlighted for you in red font color those factors that you have some degree of control over. And so certainly we need seed corn that has excellent seed quality. But in addition to that, we also need some hybrid characteristics, especially seedling vigor characteristics that allow that young crop to tolerate stresses more ably. We need seed beds and/or surface soil that's free of crust and free of compaction. We need to protect those young seeds and seedlings from insects or diseases. We certainly need adequate soil nutrients and soil pH, maybe not so much that early in the season, but for the rest of the season. Planting needs to be done as error-free as we can possibly do it to ensure, among other things, to ensure adequate and uniform seed-to-soil contact. And then finally, we need some cooperation from Mother Nature. We need adequate uniform soil temperature and soil moisture during that time period. And if all of these come together nicely, then by the end of that stand establishment period, we'll have the population that we want, and we'll have a good start to a crop that's uniform and healthy and vigorous. After that stand establishment period, after about the 6th leaf collar stage, the crop enters what's called the rapid growth period. It's a time of immense change in that plant. Prior to that, it's been growing pretty slowly. When it hits the rapid growth phase, it literally takes off like a rocket. The above ground plant material begins to develop very fast. The below ground root system begins to develop much more quickly. And during this time period, from roughly the 6th leaf collar to the 14 leaf collar growth stages, the potential size of the ear is determined. And you've heard us talk about ear size determination before. What we're really talking about is the development of the ovules on the immature ears. The ovules are what will become kernels once they've been pollinated during pollination time. But during this early rapid growth period, when everything is starting to be developed, we're talking about the number of ovules. Now, the ear that we harvest is initiated at about the 5 leaf collar stage. And we know from research that by about the 8 leaf collar stage, the maximum number of rows is already determined. And what this means is, no matter how good the rest of the growing season is, the number of rows that are there at V8 will never become larger. Now, we can go backwards with stress, but we can never get more possible rows than are there by about V8. Now, the length of ear takes a little bit longer to be determined, and it isn't set until roughly the 14 leaf collar stage or about shoulder high on me. But that determines what we call the length of the cob, whereas row number is more the girth of the cob. But both of these are going on during the rapid growth period and determining the maximum number of possible kernels. Now, here's the deal. It's preferable to get through this rapid growth period as stress-free as we can, so that the crop goes into pollination with a large number of possible kernels. One of the reasons, obviously, is yield, but secondly, is that if we go into pollination with a large number of possible kernels and then the crop undergoes stress and has to give up kernels, we're giving up from a larger number. So in reverse, if we get severe stress during that time period such that maybe we're restricting the number of rows or we are restricting the number of kernels per row, and if that results then in a fewer number of possible kernels going into pollination, and then we get more stress and we lose even more kernels, well, we're in a much tougher situation because we don't have as many kernels to give up and still get good yield. And this is the deal, is that if we lose that yield potential during the rapid growth period, if we reduce the number of possible kernels during the rapid growth period, we will never get those back, right? We are already restricted in yield. We're restricted in maximum yield by virtue of restricting that potential ear size prior to pollination. Now, sort of a second blow that can occur to the plant because of this early severe stress during the rapid growth period is it can cause problems later on in the growing season. If that early severe stress is severe enough that it potentially stunts the potential size of the photosynthetic factory later, then that smaller factory size down the road can lead to poor pollination. It can cause kernel abortion, or it can cause kernel weight. And what's maybe interesting in a somewhat depressing way is that this potential size of the factory is set pretty early. And if it's restricted early, it's hard for that plant to recover and get to full size with good growing conditions later. So it certainly makes sense during this rapid growth period to minimize the risk of any severe stress that might restrict photosynthesis. And the kinds of things that can limit photosynthesis are significant competition from severe weed infestations, soil compaction that severely limits root development, severe nutrient deficiency that really reduces that photosynthetic capacity of the young plants, significant and severe herbicide injury, or soils that are excessively wet or excessively dry. And again, on this slide, I've indicated in red the things we have some control over, and in black the things that we don't. So once the crop gets through the rapid growth period, then the actual number of kernels are determined by the success of the pollination period and growing conditions during the first 2 to 3 weeks following pollination, up through about the milk stage of development. Pollination is about a 1 to 2 week time period, and pollination can fail in response to a number of stresses that I've listed on the slide. If drought stress occurs during that time and it is extremely severe, sometimes the plant responds by delaying the emergence of the silks. And if that silk emergence is delayed long enough, sometimes the pollen has already gone by the time the silks come out, and so pollination simply can't occur. The other thing that can happen if there's severe heat or low humidity during pollination is that the silks that do emerge are exposed to this heat and low humidity, and they can actually dry out pretty quickly and become non-receptive to pollen grain that falls on them, and so pollination may not occur very successfully. Days of excessively cloudy weather can restrict photosynthesis severely enough that it will prevent pollination from occurring successfully. We've all seen instances in the past of persistent clipping of silks by insects like corn rootworm beetles or Japanese beetles. And if those insects keep those silks clipped day in and day out during the pollination period, then often there's not enough viable receptive silks that are exposed to the pollen to allow pollination to occur successfully. There are some late applied herbicides that can cause damage to the developing ovules or the developing tassels prior to pollination that can cause the whole pollination process to fail. And then simply anything that causes unhealthy plants, especially severely unhealthy plants, can cause pollination to fail by virtue of having a big impact on photosynthetic rates. Once the crop gets through pollination, then the next stage that determines kernel numbers is from late soaking through early milk stage. And it's this time period where kernels can abort in response to severe reduction of photosynthesis. It's as much as a 3-week window from the end of pollination through early milk that the plant is vulnerable or susceptible to this kind of stress that causes kernel abortion. And again, we're talking about stress that causes a severe reduction of photosynthesis. So severe nutrient deficiency, like the nitrogen deficiency that's shown in this slide, where the lower leaf canopy is already dead and fired. The upper leaf canopy is a light green. There's not much chlorophyll. There's not much photosynthesis going on. If the plant is in this shape in those early weeks coming out of pollination, it can cause a lot of kernel abortion. Similarly, severe leaf disease from something like gray leaf spot can cause enough death of leaves that it has a huge effect on the overall rate of photosynthesis in that field and cause kernel abortion. Populations that are simply too high can be a stress by themselves and can reduce the rates of photosynthesis enough to cause kernel abortion. And interestingly, if you look at immature ears prior to pollination and tease out dissect out the cobs and get a microscope or a hand lens out and count the number of ovules, quite often you'll find similar number of ovules in fields with low population versus high population, which tells us the plant's pretty resilient. But when it gets through pollination and then in these early weeks coming out of pollination, if the photosynthetic rate of those plants is not enough to sustain those kernel numbers under high populations, that will cause kernel abortion. Severe heat or drought obviously can reduce photosynthesis and cause kernel abortion, as can leaf loss due to hail. We often talk about excessively warm nights during or shortly after pollination, and what goes on is this respiration process in the nighttime hours that is necessary to maintain the health of plant tissue. But these warm nights can cause the rate of respiration to be excessively high, and basically it can use carbohydrates wastefully and leave less available for use in kernels and can cause kernel abortion. And then somewhat like I said during pollination, that if we get these consecutively cloudy days during those first couple weeks following pollination, that can have such an effect on the rates of photosynthesis that it can cause kernel abortion because of inadequate amounts of carbohydrate available to keep those kernels alive. Now, the rest of grain fill, from milk stage through black layer, is all about filling the grain and putting kernel weight to its maximum or to what we can get. And it's important to understand that even after the crop gets to the dent stage, there's a tremendous amount of yield potential yet to be deposited. And in fact, over half of the total kernel dry weight is deposited after the early dent stage of kernel development. So we're talking about the final 30 days or so leading up to black layer. And if you think about this, if you're like me, often when a field gets to that full dent stage, I breathe a sigh of relief as if the crop is made. Well, that's simply not true, because there's so much yield yet to be had, and it's extremely critical to keep that crop healthy during those final 30 days. Now let me show you the impact of kernel weight on yield by simply going through some examples of the simple grain yield estimation formula that a lot of us use late in the season, where we step off 1,000th acre lengths of row, count the number of ears in that 1,000th acre, we take a few ears from there, determine the average row number, the average number of kernels per row, And we take those three numbers, ear number, row number, and kernels per row, multiply them together, and we take that result and divide it by a kernel weight fudge factor. Now, for years, the fudge factor that we used was 90, and that represents 90,000 kernels per 56-pound bushel. Today's hybrids generally put on heavier kernels, so that fudge factor of 90 is really no longer viable. And what I use more often than not is a fudge factor closer to 80, representing 80,000 kernels per bushel. All right, but hybrids and field conditions can cause kernel weight to vary pretty dramatically, from maybe as heavy as a kernel weight factor of 65, meaning that a kernel so heavy that it only takes 65,000 for a bushel, to conditions that are extremely stressful, causing lightweight kernels to the extent where maybe the fudge factor is 100, meaning 100,000 kernels per bushel. Okay, so on this scale across the bottom, with kernel weight in terms of thousands of kernels per bushel, the heavier kernels are the low numbers and the lighter kernels are the big numbers. Okay, now in this example, I'm going to take a standard or uniform at 32,000 ears per acre, and I'm going to assume an average number of kernel rows of 16 and an average number of kernel rows of 35. So I'm going to take those three factors, but run them through the calculation using different possible kernel weight fudge factors. All right. So if we start, say, with 65,000 kernels per bushel and run through the kernel estimation formula, the yield estimate would be 276 bushels per acre. Now that's only with 32,000 ears per acre and 16 kernels per ear and 35 kernels per row. That's a pretty modest set of factors, and yet we can still achieve very high yields if kernel weight is good. Now, let's say instead of 65 for a fudge factor, we use 70, right? Still pretty good heavy kernels, but it reduces the estimated yield by 20 bushels. Just that one simple change from a 65,000 kernel bushel to a 70,000 kernel bushel, we lose 20 bushel right off the bat. If we drop it down to 75,000 per bushel, yield drops to 239 bushel. Sorry about that. There we go. I don't know why it's doing that. If we go to 80,000, it drops to 224. If we use 85 in the formula, it drops to 211. If we use 90 in the formula, it drops under 200 bushel. And if we use 95, it drops further. If we use 100, it drops to 179. So again, this huge impact of kernel weight on yield, where we could get from 276 to 179 bushels per acre simply by varying kernel weight. Now, sometimes you see this difference among hybrids from lightweight to heavier weight kernels, but you can also get this variation in kernel weight due to growing conditions and health of the plant. And again, I use this to emphasize the importance of that final 30 days of the season, from early dent stage on, where the plant is putting on the last 50% of that grain yield potential. We need to keep that crop healthy all the way to the end of the season. Because if we don't, if we get conditions that are causing inadequate plant photosynthesis during those final 30 days, the consequence will not be fewer plants per acre. The consequence will not be fewer kernels per acre. The consequence will be primarily lightweight grain. So, severe nutrient deficiency, running out of nitrogen before the end of the season, can cause lightweight kernels. Severe leaf disease from gray leaf spot, northern corn leaf blight, tar spot, those kinds of foliar diseases can cause lightweight kernels. Insect damage, and here I'm thinking maybe more along the lines of European corn borer damage, damaging the tops of the plants and therefore damaging photosynthetic capacity, can cause lightweight kernels. Excessive drought or heat stress that just shuts the plant down and reduces photosynthesis can cause lightweight grain. Obviously, if we get a hailstorm coming through, stripping the plant and reducing the photosynthetic area, the plant may hang on and finish the season, but we end up with lightweight grain. I've talked about excessively cloudy days throughout much of this presentation. Anytime we string together days and days and days of cloudy weather, or frankly even hazy, sunny weather, that can cause enough reduction in photosynthesis to cause lightweight grain. If we get early onset of stalk rots, that can lead to lightweight grains because as these plants die, their photosynthetic capacity obviously reduces, and the net result is lightweight kernels. And finally, depending on the year and to a certain degree depending on the part of the country, if there's a killing frost that occurs prior to physiological maturity, that will also shut down photosynthesis and the plants then end up with lightweight grain. Among this list, the only ones we have some control over are the first three factors. Everything else is Mother Nature. So to the extent that we can avoid nutrient deficiency, to the extent that we can minimize leaf diseases or insect damage, that's going to help us tolerate some of these other stresses that can occur. So we've come full circle in this presentation. In the first segment of this recording, we talked about the higher yields of the National Corn Yield Contest and the fact that, well, you really don't learn much from the winner's guides as to how they achieve the yields. And in this segment, we've focused more on yield components and the types of stresses and the effects of stress on the development of those yield components. So we've sort of come full circle back to this whole issue of higher yields, and it's now time to reveal the secret of getting those higher yields, but you're going to have to wait until the next recording segment of this presentation to learn those secrets. So until then, we'll see you.